Welcome to another edition of Eye on the Issues. And today we are talking about solar and wind. And it's not really the angle I think most people are expecting us to talk about. And now there's a report that was done by the National Center for Energy Analytics, a state-by-state assessment of financial assurances required by decommissioning of wind and solar facilities. One of the authors of that report, Curtis Schube. Curtis, thanks for joining us. Now, you are the executive director of the Council to Modernize Governance. Let's drill down on this report for a second and start by, I guess, give us a little bit of an overview, if you will.
Yeah, so we wrote, I work for Council to Modernize Governance, and we wrote a report last year about decommissioning of renewable energy sites. And then while we were at it, we kind of realized that there was maybe some deficiencies on what's called a financial assurance. So that's making sure there's sufficient money available to decommission a site. So when you decommission, you're taking a facility down to restore the property to a usable condition. And so when we noticed that, we also went and looked at a couple of oil and gas regulations just to compare and realized those are pretty good. And so we thought it was a good paper to be able to compare the two industries to see how they matched up.
And from what I gather, what you found was pretty significant because oil and gas, there were financial resources to deal with wells and whatnot when they're done and when they're no longer operable. But with wind and solar, not so much.
Right. So we actually looked at the regulations just to see what they demand, not necessarily what the industry has available, but we want to make sure that regulators are making sure that the companies are putting that money aside. And yes, we had 5 criteria on that we grade these industries for the regulators for oil and gas and then the regulators for renewable energy. So the 5 criteria would be mandatory language, meaning they shall have the money there, not may, and a fixed amount, meaning like a concrete number that they will need to have 50,000 aside or something to that effect. Also, a sufficient amount, meaning enough to cover the cost of decommissioning. In an irrevocable form. So like we can't have a revocable trust having the money because obviously they can draw from that and it may not be there later. And then finally, the 5th would be to have the money there before the start of the construction of the site. So yeah, when we did that, we noticed a pretty stark difference. So of the 49 states that have renewable energy, there was only one A grade. When you compare that to oil and gas, 2/3 of those states had an A grade. With renewable energy, you had 28 failing grades. With oil and gas, you only had 1 failing grade. If you boil that down into a GPA, renewable energy would be a 1.18 GPA, and oil and gas would be a 3.4 GPA. So you can see there's a pretty stark difference between those two industries.
And Virginia is the only state that got the A.
Correct.
And tell us a little, I mean, you kind of explained it, but a little bit more about why.
Yeah, so Virginia would just be, there's nothing in particular notable about it other than they checked all the different boxes. So, they had sufficient money, it's available before the commencement. They can't draw upon or take that money away. It's shall language, not may language. Like it fit all the different criteria that, you would see for oil and gas.
And then you talked about the large number of failing grades. One of those is the state that we are focusing on here, Wyoming. Yeah. Tell us more about that.
So Wyoming's a little bit different than a lot of the states, but the reason why we gave it an F grade is for a few different reasons. So the first would be that some of it's regulated at the state level, some of it's regulated at the local level. The reason why we see that as problematic is that, leaving it to local government could also leave it to the discretion of those local governments, meaning they could have insufficient regulations at the local level. We like to see it done at the state level so that the state's assuring that all the counties are doing it correctly. So the way that Wyoming does that is for large facilities, they do regulate it statewide. For smaller facilities, they regulate it at local. Another problem that we saw is that if it's a utility, they're exempt from this law, meaning that they don't have to have financial assurance put aside. And then also, if you kind of boil it down even to how the local governments are regulating it, you have some problems. So you have may, meaning they may have that money aside. That lets them wiggle out of the demand. And then another problem too is the forms of financial assurance that they list. Some of them are revocable, meaning again, you can draw upon that money. So there's a lot of ways that you have the potential to have quote unquote orphaned facilities within the state of Wyoming.
And let's talk for a second, if we can, about the actual products that are used to create wind power, wind electricity
Mhm.
that's wind driven, as well as solar. I mean, these are products that have a shelf life of how long?
So, I mean, if you were to ask the industry, they would say 30 years. But we're finding that both with wind and solar, these facilities are wearing out much quicker than they're projected. So it's hard to give it a hard number because this still is kind of an emerging industry, meaning that, it's not more than 30 years old yet. But we are finding that some of these nationwide, I'm talking not Wyoming, but nationwide, we're finding that some of these sites are wearing out as short as like 18 to 20 years. Which means that the demand to have these decommissioning financial assurance regulations in place is it's now, it's not a future problem.
And when it comes to wind and solar, you think renewable, you think great, everything is positive, 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 but it's not all positive.
Yeah, so going into what decommissioning entails, for wind, you've got to take down the turbines. You got to take down the base of it. Some of the so turbines, there is some technology that suggests that they might be recyclable, but it's like I think like $28 per $1 to put it in a landfill, so it's not really economically feasible yet. Um, Another problem too is the last time I checked, only 3 or 4 landfills nationwide would take these turbines. So, in a lot of states, they have to truck it to another state to get it to a landfill that would take it, and that's assuming that these landfills will be able to take this large quantity of turbines that are set to be decommissioned in the coming years. Solar has another problem. Those use toxic materials. So, again, they're going into landfills, but they've got to figure out a way to contain the toxicity.
Now, let's talk for nuclear for a quick second. Nuclear began in I guess, really 60s, 70s, and 80s really became more prevalent. And I don't think it was really, really well thought out what we're going to do with the spent nuclear fuel. So let's not talk about nuclear more than that right now. And then jumping over to the renewables when it comes to wind and solar. Do you think it was well thought out? What are we going to do with all this stuff, or is that something that became almost an afterthought?
So I think it's interesting where I think we're finding that renewables are falling into the same trap that, coal and oil industries fell into decades ago. We're all familiar with orphaned wells. We've heard that term, or abandoned coal mines. Like those are terms we've heard, and as a result, the federal government has to step, or sometimes maybe state, have to step in and use taxpayer dollars to fix that problem. And I think with renewable energy, we're running into that exact same problem now. We're excited about, not we, but the nation collectively is excited about these new technologies and the potential that they bring. But I think that they're getting maybe over exuberant and they're passing regulations to allow for them to occur, but without really thinking through what happens on the tail end.
So, what would your message be to lawmakers for example, in a state like Wyoming? What's the biggest message you think that came through from this report?
Yeah, so lawmakers need to step in. They need to regulate the industry using, I think that a great start would be the 5 criteria we've listed in our report. Um, you know, there's some great models. You can look to oil and gas. Again, the financials would be different, but the principles are there. Or, if we wanted to look to Virginia, that's a great model as well.
And so, for people to read this report, they can go to the National Center for Energy Analytics and where else?
Also, modernizegovernance.org will have it on their website, our website as well.
Fantastic. Okay. Is there anything we were not covering that you encountered during your investigation?
No, I think we've covered it well. You've asked great questions today.
Okay, fantastic. Okay. All right. Well, Curtis, thank you so much for your time. And if you have other reports like this coming down the pipeline on other topics, well, let's talk about those in the future. Thanks for
Great.
joining us.
Will
If
do.
people want to learn more about what's happening around the state of Wyoming, just go to wyliberty.org and sign up for our newsletter. Thanks again, Curtis.
Yeah, thank you for having me.